In 1588, Spain controlled an empire so vast that the sun literally never set on its territories. They had more gold than any nation in history. Their military was unmatched. Their currency was the global reserve. 50 years later, they were bankrupt, 3 times over. In 1945, Britain ruled over 450 million people across a quarter of the Earth's land. The pound sterling was money itself, the currency every merchant, every trader, every nation trusted above all others. 25 years later, Britain was begging the IMF for emergency loans just to keep the lights on. In 1945, the Soviet Union emerged from the ashes of World War II as a global superpower. They had nuclear weapons, space technology, military might that terrified the West. Central planning had transformed a feudal peasant society into an industrial giant in just 3 decades. 45 years later, Soviet citizens were standing in breadlines, and the entire system collapsed in on itself like a dying star. Here's what's terrifying. These weren't 3 random failures. They followed the exact same pattern, the same 7 stages, stage by stage, almost like clockwork. And right now, in 2025, the United States is showing symptoms of stages 5 and 6. This isn't about politics. This isn't about left versus right. This is about a pattern that has repeated itself across 5 centuries of history, a pattern that seems to govern how dominant powers fall. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So the question isn't whether this pattern is real. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is, are we already past the point of no return? Before we dive into the 7 stages, we need to understand something fundamental about how empires and economic superpowers actually work. Because the popular story we tell ourselves, that they collapse because of military defeat or moral decay, is completely wrong. The real story is about something far more boring and far more deadly: fiscal mathematics. Every dominant power in history has risen on the back of a specific financial innovation. Spain discovered how to extract and monetize New World silver on an unprecedented scale. Britain invented modern government bonds and central banking. The Soviet Union pioneered total economic mobilization through central planning. The United States created the petrodollar system and global financial integration. These weren't just clever tricks. They were genuine revolutions that allowed these powers to punch far above their weight, to finance military operations that should have been impossible, to project power across continents and oceans. But here's the twist that nobody talks about. The same financial innovation that allows a power to rise also contains the seeds of its destruction. Not might contain, always contains. Why? Because every financial innovation is eventually pushed to its breaking point. The people in charge, whether monarchs, parliaments, or politburos, always ask the same question. If this worked so well to finance our rise, why not use it more? Why not push it further? And that's where the pattern begins. Let me introduce you to the 3 empires that will teach us this pattern. Each operated in a completely different era. Each had completely different political systems. Each fell for seemingly different reasons. But when you strip away the surface details, when you look at the underlying financial mechanics, they all followed the same 7-stage collapse pattern. Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries taught us stages 1 through 3. Britain in the 20th century showed us stages 4 and 5. The Soviet Union demonstrated stages 6 and 7. And the United States? Well, we're living through the pattern right now. Let's start with Spain, because their story reveals something shocking about what really drives empire collapse. Stage 1, the golden age of solvency. Spain in 1500 wasn't a superpower. It wasn't even particularly wealthy. It was a recently unified kingdom that had just finished a centuries-long reconquest of its own territory from Muslim rulers. Then came 1492, Columbus, and the discovery that would change everything. Within 50 years, Spanish conquistadors had toppled the Aztec and Inca empires, and they discovered something that European powers had been desperately seeking for centuries: mountains of silver. Literal mountains of it, in places like Potosi in modern-day Bolivia. The Potosi silver mine was the greatest treasure strike in human history. At its peak, it produced 60% of the world's silver. Spanish galleons carried this silver back to Europe by the ton. And here's what made this a genuine financial innovation. Spain didn't just hoard the silver, they used it as the foundation of the first truly global currency system. Spanish silver, reales, became the currency of international trade. If you were a merchant in Manila, Amsterdam, or Cairo, you wanted to be paid in Spanish silver. This gave Spain an extraordinary advantage. They could finance military operations, build armadas, fight wars across Europe, all because they controlled the money supply of the world economy. From 1500 to 1550, Spain was in stage 1, the golden age of solvency. They had access to real wealth, silver flowing from the Americas. They were fiscally conservative by the standards of the era. They used their advantage wisely. King Charles I was cautious. He borrowed modestly. He balanced books. He understood that the silver, while abundant, was still finite. This is what stage 1 always looks like. Genuine productivity, real wealth creation, and most importantly, restraint. Stage 2, the temptation to leverage. Then Charles's son, Philip II, became king in 1556. Philip looked at the Spanish silver flowing into royal coffers and asked the fatal question, why limit ourselves to what we have? Why not borrow against future silver shipments? This is the moment every dominant power faces, the moment when leverage becomes irresistible. Philip had good reasons, or so he thought. He was fighting wars on multiple fronts, against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, preparing for the invasion of England. These wars were expensive, but Philip had something no other monarch possessed, a seemingly infinite source of silver. So he went to the bankers of Genoa and Germany and made a simple pitch. Lend me money now. I'll pay you back with interest when the next silver fleet arrives from the Americas. The bankers agreed. Why wouldn't they? Spain literally controlled the money mines. It was the safest bet in the world. This is stage 2, the temptation to leverage. The power begins borrowing against future revenues, and at first it works beautifully. Spain could finance military operations that would have been impossible with just current revenues. They could fight multiple wars simultaneously. They could maintain garrisons across Europe. From 1556 to 1575, this strategy seemed brilliant. But here's what Philip didn't understand, what no leader in stage 2 ever understands. He wasn't just borrowing money, he was borrowing from his own future, and that future had a breaking point. Stage 3, the revenue trap. By 1575, something strange was happening to the Spanish economy. Silver was still flowing in from the Americas, more than ever actually. But Spain itself was getting poorer. Here's why. Philip had borrowed so heavily that most of the incoming silver was immediately sent out again to pay interest on debts. The bankers got their cut. Then more had to go to finance ongoing wars. Then more to service even more debts taken out to cover the previous debts. Spanish economists at the time called it the revolving door of silver. It came in through the port of Seville and immediately flowed back out to Genoa, Augsburg and Antwerp. This is stage 3, the revenue trap. The costs of maintaining the empire now exceed the revenues it generates, but this fact is hidden by increasing debt. And here's the truly insidious part. Spain's dominance itself was making the problem worse. Because Spain was flooding the world with silver, the value of silver was dropping. Inflation was raging across Europe, what historians call the price revolution of the 16th century. Prices quadrupled between 1500 and 1600. So Spain needed even more silver to pay for the same goods, which meant borrowing even more, which meant even more debt service. Philip II declared bankruptcy in 1557, then again in 1560, then 1575, then 1596, 4 times in 40 years. But here's the thing. Each bankruptcy didn't end the system, it just reset it. Philip would default on his debts, negotiate with the bankers, promise reform, and then immediately start borrowing again. Because he had no choice. The costs of empire, the garrisons, the fleets, the wars, couldn't be cut without admitting weakness. This is the revenue trap. You can't stop borrowing because the costs are too high, but borrowing makes the problem worse. You're stuck. Spain spent the next century in this trap, slowly bleeding to death financially while still maintaining the appearance of power. Now let's jump forward 300 years to understand stages 4 and 5. Because Britain's experience in the 20th century shows us what happens when a dominant power hits the breaking point. Stage 4, the currency crisis. Britain in 1900 was the Spain of its era, but even more dominant. The pound sterling wasn't just a currency, it was the currency. London was the financial capital of the world. British banks financed projects from Argentina to Australia. British naval power enforced a global trading system, and Britain had figured out something Spain never did. You don't need gold and silver mines if you can convince the world to trust your currency itself. The pound was backed by gold. The gold standard. Any pound note could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. This created trust. This created stability. And this allowed Britain to borrow on a scale that would have been impossible otherwise. Britain entered World War I as the world's creditor. They left it as the world's debtor. The war cost Britain 40% of its national wealth. They borrowed heavily from the United States, which emerged from the war as the new financial superpower. But British politicians made a fateful decision after the war: return the pound to its pre-war gold parity. This was about prestige, about maintaining the appearance of financial strength, about proving that the pound was still as good as gold. Winston Churchill, as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1925, oversaw this return to gold, and it was a catastrophe. Returning to the pre-war gold parity meant the pound was overvalued by about 10%. This made British exports expensive and uncompetitive. It meant British workers needed to take wage cuts to maintain employment. It triggered a wave of strikes and social unrest. But more fundamentally, it locked Britain into a trap. To maintain the gold standard, the Bank of England had to keep interest rates high to attract gold. High interest rates meant slow economic growth. Slow growth meant lower tax revenues. Lower revenues meant more borrowing. Britain was now in stage 4, the currency crisis. The financial foundation of power, the pound's dominance, was eroding. But admitting this would mean admitting that Britain was no longer the global financial centre, so they denied it. They defended the pound. They insisted everything was fine. Then came 1931. A banking crisis in Austria spread to Germany, then to Britain. Investors started pulling gold out of London, terrified that Britain couldn't maintain the gold standard. The Bank of England's gold reserves were hemorrhaging. In September 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound fell by 25% almost immediately. This was the moment Britain lost its financial superpower status. Not in 1945 after World War II. In 1931, during a financial crisis most people have never heard of. Stage 5, the austerity delusion. But Britain didn't accept this new reality. They couldn't. Because accepting it would mean accepting that the empire was over. So they tried austerity. Cut government spending, balance the budget, restore confidence. This is stage 5, the austerity delusion. The belief that fiscal discipline alone can restore past glory. The 1930s in Britain were grim. Unemployment above 15%. Entire industrial regions devastated, growing political extremism. But the government kept insisting that belt-tightening was the path back to greatness. Then came World War II, and the final destruction of Britain's financial position. Britain ended the war victorious militarily but bankrupt financially. They owed enormous debts to the United States. They'd liquidated overseas investments to pay for the war. The empire was becoming expensive to maintain as independence movements gained strength. But British politicians still couldn't let go. They tried to maintain global military commitments in Greece, Palestine, Malaya, Korea. They tried to maintain the empire. They tried to keep the pound as a reserve currency. The breaking point came in 1967. After years of austerity, balance of payments crises and IMF interventions, Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 14%. Prime Minister Harold Wilson went on television and told the British people, "It does not mean that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse or in your bank, has been devalued." It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. The pound had been devalued. British buying power had decreased. The era of British financial dominance was over. By 1976, Britain was so broke they had to go to the IMF for a bailout, like a developing country. This is what stage 5 looks like: denial, austerity, repeated crises, and a slow, grinding acceptance of reduced status. Now we need to talk about the Soviet Union, because their collapse shows us the final 2 stages and reveals something terrifying about what happens when a system reaches the point of no return. Stage 6, the legitimacy crisis. The Soviet Union's story is different from Spain and Britain because they weren't a financial empire. They were an ideological empire. Their power came from a promise. Central planning works. Communism delivers prosperity. The Soviet model is the future. From the 1930s through the 1960s, this promise seemed credible. The USSR transformed from a peasant society into a nuclear superpower. They won World War II. They launched Sputnik. They achieved universal literacy and healthcare. Growth rates were impressive. But by the 1970s, something was breaking. Soviet growth was slowing. Consumer goods were scarce. Technology was falling behind the West. The economy was increasingly dependent on oil exports, and when oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, Soviet revenues collapsed with them. But here's what made this Stage 6 the legitimacy crisis. The Soviet leadership knew the system wasn't working. They had the economic data. They could see the problems. But they couldn't fix it without admitting that the fundamental promise was false, that central planning didn't work, that the entire ideological foundation of Soviet power was built on sand. When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he tried to reform the system with glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He thought he could fix the economic problems while maintaining the Soviet system. He was wrong, because once you admit that reforms are necessary, you've admitted that the system failed. Once you allow openness, people start asking questions about everything. Why are we poorer than the West? Why have we been lied to? Why should the Communist Party maintain its monopoly on power? This is what makes Stage 6 so dangerous. Any attempt to fix the problems undermines the legitimacy of the entire system. By 1989, the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe was collapsing. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany all broke free. The Berlin Wall fell. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. 15 republics became independent nations. The hammer and sickle came down from the Kremlin for the last time. Stage 7, the collapse. Stage 7 is what came after for Russia, the collapse. This isn't just economic decline, this is systemic breakdown. The Russian economy shrank by 40% between 1991 and 1998, a depression worse than the American Great Depression. Life expectancy fell, birth rates collapsed, crime exploded, oligarchs looted state assets, the ruble lost 99% of its value against the dollar. In 1998, Russia defaulted on its debts. Pensioners lost their life savings. This is what Stage 7 looks like. The systems that held society together, currency stability, rule of law, social safety nets, government functionality, all break down simultaneously. And here's the darkest part. There's no guarantee of recovery. Russia eventually stabilized under Putin, but it never regained superpower status. It became a regional power with nuclear weapons, still dangerous, but no longer a rival to American global dominance. Some nations that hit Stage 7 never recover their former position, ever. So let's talk about the United States in 2025. Where exactly are we in this 7-stage pattern? Stage 1, the golden age of solvency. This was post-World War II America, from 1945 to roughly 1971. The United States emerged from the war as the only major industrial power, with its infrastructure intact. The dollar became the global reserve currency, backed by gold. American GDP was 50% of world GDP. The US was a creditor nation. Stage 2, the temptation to leverage. This began in the 1960s with the Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson's guns and butter policy, trying to fight a war while expanding domestic programs without raising taxes. By 1971, the US had to abandon the gold standard because foreign governments were exchanging dollars for gold faster than US reserves could handle. Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar became a purely fiat currency. Stage 3, the revenue trap. This is where it gets interesting. After 1971, the US developed the petrodollar system, ensuring oil was priced in dollars globally. This created continued demand for dollars. It allowed the US to run persistent trade deficits and government deficits that would have destroyed any other currency. We could print dollars and export them in exchange for real goods. The Reagan era of the 1980s marked the full entry into the revenue trap. Military spending increased dramatically, tax revenues fell, deficits exploded. But nobody worried because foreign governments kept buying US Treasury bonds. From the 1980s through the 2008 financial crisis, America was deep in Stage 3, borrowing to maintain military commitments worldwide, borrowing to finance consumption, borrowing to paper over the loss of manufacturing jobs. But it worked because the dollar remained the reserve currency. Stage 4, the currency crisis. This is where we are now. Not an acute crisis yet, but the warning signs are everywhere. US national debt is $36 trillion. That's 122% of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments on the debt will become the largest single government expense by 2030, larger than defense, larger than Social Security. Think about that. The US government will spend more money just servicing its debt than on its entire military. But more importantly, the dollar's role as the global reserve currency is being challenged for the first time since 1945. China and Russia are conducting trade in their own currencies. The BRICS nations are discussing a common currency. Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan for oil. Central banks worldwide are diversifying away from dollar reserves into gold and other currencies. The dollar still makes up about 58% of global central bank reserves, but that's down from 71% in 1999. The decline is accelerating. This is exactly what happened to the pound sterling between 1931 and 1967. A slow, grinding loss of confidence, not a collapse, but a steady erosion. Stage 5. The austerity delusion. We're seeing the early signs of this now. Political debates about cutting Social Security, Medicare, discretionary spending, both parties talking about fiscal responsibility, while neither actually reducing deficits. But here's the trap. Actual austerity, the kind that would meaningfully reduce the debt, would require cutting defense spending, entitlement programs, and raising taxes. Any politician who seriously proposes this loses their next election. So instead we get performative austerity. Commissions and reports and stern warnings, followed by continued borrowing. Britain spent from 1945 to 1976 in this stage, 31 years of denial and half measures before finally accepting reality. The pattern we can't ignore. Here's the data that should terrify you. Spain took about 100 years to go from peak power to irrelevance, 1580 to 1680. Britain took about 50 years, 1920 to 1970. The Soviet Union took about 20 years, 1970 to 1991. The pattern is accelerating. Why? Because the modern world is more interconnected. Financial crises spread faster. Currency shifts happen overnight instead of over decades. Information flows instantly. Spain could maintain the illusion of power for a century because communication was slow and economic integration was limited. America might not have decades. And here's the most disturbing parallel. Every one of these powers thought they were different. Spanish advisors told Philip II that Spain was eternal because they had divine providence and silver mines. British politicians in the 1960s insisted the pound would remain a reserve currency because of Britain's financial sophistication. Soviet leaders believed Marxist theory proved capitalism would collapse first. They were all wrong. The United States in 2025 tells itself, we're different because we have the most dynamic economy, because of our technology sector, because everyone needs dollars for oil, because our military is unmatched, because the dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Spain had silver, Britain had empire, the Soviets had ideology. What backs the dollar? Increasingly just the momentum of the existing system, and momentum can reverse. Let me give you 3 specific warning signs that we're further along this pattern than most people realize. Warning sign 1. The debt service death spiral. When interest payments on your debt become a major budget item, you enter a death spiral, because now you're borrowing not to invest in infrastructure, defense, or programs, but just to pay interest on past borrowing. The US paid $659 billion in interest on the national debt in fiscal year 2023. That's more than defense spending on veterans' benefits, education, and energy combined. And with higher interest rates, this number is exploding. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest costs will exceed $1.4 trillion by 2034. This is exactly what killed Spain. By 1600, most of the silver flowing into royal coffers immediately flowed back out as interest payments. Warning sign 2. The replacement currency infrastructure. For the first time since 1944, there's serious infrastructure being built for international trade that bypasses the dollar. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CEPS, is a direct competitor to SWIFT. It processed over $12 trillion in transactions in 2023. The Emberidge project is testing a common currency platform for 130 countries. This isn't speculation. This is actual financial infrastructure being built right now. Britain, in the 1950s, watched as the dollar gradually replaced the pound for international trade. They couldn't stop it because the economics were inexorable. The US economy was larger, more dynamic, and more trustworthy. China's economy is already larger than America's in purchasing power parity terms, and the US has weaponized the dollar with sanctions so aggressively that even allies are nervous about dollar dependence. Warning sign 3, the legitimacy question. Remember stage 6, the legitimacy crisis. This is when the population starts questioning whether the system itself works. American trust in institutions is at historic lows. Trust in Congress is below 20%. Trust in the media is below 40%. Political polarization is at levels not seen since the Civil War. Both the left and right agree the system is broken. They just disagree on why and how to fix it. This is exactly the dynamic that preceded Soviet collapse. By the late 1980s, Soviet citizens across the political spectrum agreed the system had failed. They just had different visions of what should replace it. When legitimacy collapses, everything else follows. So what do we do with this information? Let me give you 3 clear takeaways. Takeaway 1, patterns don't care about exceptionalism. Every dominant power in history believed it was exceptional, that the rules didn't apply to them, that their circumstances were unique. They were all wrong. The 7-stage collapse pattern has repeated across 5 centuries, across completely different political systems, across different technologies and economies. It's not a prediction. It's a recognition of systemic forces that no amount of willpower or exceptionalism can overcome. The United States is not exempt from mathematics. Takeaway 2, the window for meaningful reform is narrow. If the pattern holds, we're somewhere between stage 4 and early stage 5. That means we probably have 10 to 15 years before we hit the irreversible dynamics of stage 6. What would meaningful reform look like? Reducing military commitments globally, fundamental restructuring of entitlement programs, significant tax increases on those who can afford them, accepting that America will be one major power among several rather than the global hegemon. They couldn't afford. The Soviets could have reformed if they'd been willing to admit that central planning had fundamental flaws, but none of them did, because the political incentives always favour short-term stability over long-term reform. So the question isn't, will America follow this pattern? The question is, what would it take to break the pattern? And I don't have an answer to that question. I'm not sure anyone does, but understanding the pattern is the first step, because you can't solve a problem you don't understand. The Spanish didn't understand why the silver wasn't saving them. The British didn't understand that defending the pound was destroying their economy. The Soviets didn't understand that their reforms would collapse the entire system. We have the advantage of historical perspective. We can see the pattern. We can recognize the stages. Whether we can actually do anything about it, that's the $1 trillion question. Or maybe the $36 trillion question. If this video changed how you see America's economic trajectory, share it. The mainstream financial media won't talk about these patterns because it's too uncomfortable. But these are the conversations we need to be having. Check out the sources in the description. I've linked to the historical economic data on Spain's debt defaults, Britain's IMF crisis documents, and current projections on US debt service costs. Verify everything I've said, do your own research, and subscribe if you want more videos that challenge conventional wisdom with historical evidence. Because understanding these patterns isn't about pessimism, it's about preparation. The collapse pattern is real. The question is what we do about it. Thanks for watching.